Hey, and welcome to the Play 20 and to the last impulse on Channel 2, Play on Stage. So our next impulse is from Bo Ruberg, who is an assistant professor at the University of California in Irvine. Bo's research is exploring gender and sexuality in digital media. So due to the time difference between Germany and California, we have a pre-recorded presentation from Bo, which we will watch now. And however, Bo Ruberg will be available on our Discord channel at 5 p.m. Central Europe time. So enjoy Bo's presentation and have fun.
Hi, I'm Bo Ruberg. I am here presenting my video for my keynote. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks for listening. Thanks for having me. I'm going to jump over to my slides, but I just want to start by saying it's great to be here and to virtually see you all. Okay, so hi, like I said, I am Bo Ruberg. I am an assistant professor at the University of California, Irvine, which is in Southern California, just a little bit south of LA. I work in the Department of Film and Media Studies, and I use they, them pronouns. So thank you again to the organizers for having me here. I'm really excited to be speaking with you. It's especially exciting to be speaking to an international audience. I'm coming from the US, obviously, so I'm really glad to be able to be in dialogue. Here's my plan for this talk. So I'm going to give you kind of a quick introduction to the intersection of queerness and video games, which is what I work on. Then I'm going to be talking about the specific topic of my talk today, which is what I call the queer games avant-garde. After doing a kind of introduction of the queer games avant-garde, I'm going to draw out some themes and some threads that cross the work of various artists who are part of this avant-garde. Then I'm going to look at some tensions and some differences across their work so that we can draw out those places of friction. And then I'm going to conclude by offering some new ways of thinking, and I especially want to think about the questions that this conference is raising around borders and boundaries and obstacles. So that's how we'll wrap up. So just a little bit more about me so that you know who it is who's talking to you now. Like I said, I work at the University of California, Irvine, but I've been kind of all over California. I got my PhD at Berkeley, which is in Northern California, in conjunction with the Center for New Media. I was a postdoc at the University of Southern California in what's called the Interactive Media and Games Division, which is the game design department. And I've also, for a long time, been in dialogue with the games industry, especially in the Bay Area. I used to be a tech journalist, so I'm often presenting at events like the Game Developers Conference and thinking about how to translate this research to game development in the games industry. I work, broadly speaking, on gender and sexuality in digital media, but my focus, as you'll see as I'm talking today, is really on queer issues in video games. And I should say that here at UCI, where I work, I definitely am not working alone. I do a lot of work in collaboration. I really believe in academic community. So I co-run a lab, which is a kind of sciencey way of just saying like a research group, myself and my colleague Erin Hermel, and these are some of our wonderful grad students, they're PhD students who we do a lot of work in collaboration with. So like I said, a lot of my work is on the intersection of queerness and video games, so LGBT issues in video games. These are some of the books that I have worked on or written And I bring them up here just because I think they're useful to show you sort of the breadth of ways of approaching some of these topics. So the first one, which is called Queer Game Studies, came out in 2017. It's an edited volume that I edited with Adrian Shaw. So this is a great one for having lots of different voices in it. It's got academics, but also journalists, also game designers, kind of all exploring what it might mean to look at gender and sexuality and identity in intersection with games. The second book, which came out in 2019, so last year, is called Video Games Have Always Been Queer. This is one that I wrote, and this is kind of the core of my academic thinking. So it's about looking at video games that you might not think of as queer, games that don't seem to have really any LGBT characters in them, don't seem to have like, you know, same-sex romance options, but it uses queer theory, the kind of academic realm of queer theory, to argue that we can find queer meaning in video games, even when they don't seem to represent queer people. And then this latest book, which is the one that I'm going to talk about more today, is called The Queer Games Avant-Garde, How LGBTQ Game Makers Are Reimagining the Medium of Video Games. And this project I think of as kind of the sister project to Video Games Have Always Been Queer. It's, you know, not me sitting in a room doing academic analysis. It comes from interviews with game designers, and specifically queer and trans indie game designers. So that's the one I'm going to be talking about today. So before I get into that, I wanted to give you kind of a super quick overview of what happens when we think about queerness and video games together. I say this is super quick because sometimes people have this idea that this is a kind of niche topic. Is really not. There are, you know, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of queer people, you know, playing and writing about and making meaning from games. There are tons of queer and trans game designers, as we'll talk about. And there are also like dozens and dozens of academics whose specialty is this area, all different pieces of it. So there's actually a ton to talk about. So the first thing to start with is this word queer. Depending on your background, you may already feel really comfortable with this term, but I like to start by explaining what I mean by it. Because it's a word that means a lot of different things and to a lot of different people. And it's, you know, here because we're talking across languages, we're talking across national context. I just want to be clear what I mean. So queer can kind of mean two main things. The first is that it's kind of an umbrella term for LGBTQ people. So, you know, anyone who's lesbian or gay or trans or bi or intersex or asexual all fit under that umbrella of queer because they're not normative in their gender or sexual identities. But there's also another meaning of queer that is related, but it comes more through academic thinking, also through activism, which is about queerness as kind of anything that resists or doesn't fit or subverts what's called heteronormativity. So that's the sort of, you can see the hetero is the straight part, the normativity is that what is normative. So we've got both that more conceptual idea and the idea of queerness that's specifically about identity. So like I was saying, this is the way we can think about the second more conceptual version is queerness resists or rejects norms of sexuality and gender. I also like to take a moment to explain what I mean by video games when I talk about queerness in games. And this is one that, especially for you here in this group, may seem so obvious that it's like, why are we even defining it? But often a lot of people still have a very limited view of what it means to talk about games, right? So they think about Grand Theft Auto, they think about first-person shooters, or they think about, you know, something like Minecraft that is definitely not only for kids, but sort of associated with kids and with education. But when I talk about video games, I'm definitely not talking about just that. I'm talking about a much wider range of games. You know, it includes mobile games, it includes casual games, it includes games on all different platforms. I'm personally drawn to really silly, strange, colorful games. You can maybe tell from my like very colorful shirt that I really like that kind of, that sort of goofy rainbowy aesthetic. So these are just some of my favorite games from the last few years. But that's just to say that all of that is encompassed when I talk about queerness in games together. So what do we find at this intersection of queerness in games? I'm going to walk you through some different things. So one thing that comes up a lot, maybe the first thing that usually comes up, is LGBT representation in mainstream games, in AAA games. So a recent example of that came out over the summer is The Last of Us Part 2, which featured a lesbian protagonist, Ellie. We also see examples in Overwatch, Assassin's Creed, Mass Effect, the Mass Effect games, like lots of different places. I think there are questions about whether we're seeing more LGBT characters, whether we're always seeing good representation. But one of the things that hopefully talking about queerness in games will encourage us to think about is not just putting LGBT characters in big mainstream games, but what are the other ways we can think about queerness in relationship to this medium. So other things we could talk about queer community. So there are actually some really amazing queer communities around games. There have been for a while now. I'm one of the co-founders and co-organizers of this conference, the Queerness in Games Conference, which happens roughly every year. It's happened since 2013. And it's a really amazing event for bringing together queer academics, queer designers, all to talk about games. But there are lots of other community spaces like this as well. We could talk about queer games history. On the left, you see a poster for an entire exhibit that took place in Germany, curated by Adrian Shaw, just about the LGBT history of games. We could talk about queer fandom and the way that it makes something new and something queer out of games that may not seem explicitly queer. There's another piece of this that comes up often in my research, and this is kind of like where my heart is, maybe, I don't know, which is, like I was saying before, looking at games that don't seem to be about LGBT issues, but interpreting them in that way. So often that means not just looking at the stories they tell, but looking at their interactive elements, their design elements. So their mechanics, or their interfaces, or their controls, their win states, their fail states, right? All of these things, and looking for meaning in them. So one of these games that I love to talk about this way is Octodad, which is a game about being a very floppy yellow octopus kind of poured into this business suit and trying to move around and pass as a suburban dad in this very like straight, very white suburbia. Another game that I've been thinking about in this way that I also really love is Natalie Lawhead's Everything is Going to Be Okay, which is this collection of like short game-like experiences that kind of take over your desktop and you know, are cute and strange, but also very serious and kind of apocalyptic at the same time. So these are both examples of games that, even though they don't seem to be about LGBT issues, kind of resonate. Octodad really resonates with the idea of passing, kind of queer passing, trans passing. Everything is Going to Be Okay kind of resonates with queer experiences of, we talk about like failure and an inability to feel like you fit in and feeling like you're in kind of constant crisis. But the piece of this whole equation, you know, I've been talking you through different ways to think about queerness in games. The piece of the equation I want to focus on here is what I'm calling the queer games avant-garde. So I'll talk to you more about what I mean by that right here. So the queer games avant-garde, as I talk about it here in this project, is a network of queer and trans game developers at the forefront of contemporary video game design. So what that means is that this is an entire world, and an increasingly growing world, of queer and trans folks who make games, who are definitely not just one community. We don't want to simplify that, but a kind of broad network. They don't just make digital games. Definitely also folks make analog games. So my research focuses on digital games, but there are lots of other types of games too. And the point that I am really trying to make with this project is that it's not just that they're making games, it's that they are making games at the forefront of the medium. So they are doing the work that is experimental. They are doing the work that's pushing what we think of as video games in new directions. So some background on the queer games avant-garde. There have been queer folks making games as long as there have been games. But this particular network of game makers, we can say, started in about 2012. And Anthropy was really instrumental in these early days. This is her book, Rise of the Video Game Zinesters, which really kind of, for a lot of people, sparked the idea that they can make their own games. We saw kind of early network and early community of folks operating in Oakland in Northern California. So that's where some of these early figures come in. But then over the years, this has just grown exponentially. So it's no longer about any one game maker. It's no longer about any one community of game makers. If we look on platforms like itch.io, this is just a recent search with 1,230 results just for the LGBT tag. That's definitely not comprehensive. There are things that don't fall into that. So it's just to give you a sense that there is so much more out there. It's really exploded. So for this project, what I did is I reached out to designers, some of whom I just admired their work, some of whom I had the chance to collaborate with before for the Queerness in Games conference. And I conducted a series of interviews. So I did about 25 interviews in total. And represented in this project is a kind of range of queer game makers. So folks like Dietrich Schwenkofer, Robert Yang, Jess Marcotte, Nikki Case, Maddie Bryce, Avery Alder. And then for each of them, I did interviews that were long. So they were about 2 hours long. And here's why. I really wanted to get beyond the kind of standard diversity narratives. So often when these folks are interviewed by the press, they are asked kind of the same questions about, are video games homophobic? How do we make them better? Are they getting more diverse? And those are real questions, but they're also oversimplified questions. So I wanted to get past that and start talking about things like people's politics, their aesthetics, their game design process. I was hoping to create a project that could be an inspiration both for academics like myself, but also for designers. So interviews that were accessible for people who are making their own games. And then I really wanted to be centering marginalized voices. So instead of just writing a book about their work, I wanted the book to itself be a platform for how they talk about their own work. So some of the questions, just to give you a sense of how these interviews work, some of the questions that I asked were things like, what was your personal background with games? What other artistic influences do you look to beyond games? And then how do you see the politics of your design practice playing out? So here are some kind of themes and threads that cross these interviews, and I'm going to talk to you about some of the patterns that I see coming across them and what we can learn from those. So one thing that came up really frequently in how people talked about their work is this idea that queer and trans indie games often resist empathy and question audience. So what that means is they kind of challenge this idea that games by marginalized people are supposed to make other people, help them step into their shoes, make them feel more empathetic. And instead, these games kind of push back on that and say, maybe I'm not making a game for straight people or cis people to learn more. Maybe I'm making a game for other queer people. So we see that, for example, in work like Maddie Bryce's installation Empathy Machine, which is one in which players actually have to control a game by using bits of a controller strapped to Maddie's own body. And so it kind of forces you to confront the realness of someone's experience. And also in work like that by ABB, for example, this is her game We Know the Devil, which is about trans kids at a Christian summer camp and monsters. And I thought it was really interesting what ABB said about this. So this is an excerpt from her interview. She said, "I'm not trying to make games for straight people. At some point, I had the revelation that I didn't need to make work that was accessible for as wide an audience as possible. We Know the Devil is super autobiographical, but it's also about me starting from that autobiographical history and finding alternative avenues out of it." So the two things I find really interesting here, one is this idea of not making games for straight people. And the other is that this might be autobiographical, right? It's largely based on her own experiences, but it's not trying to represent something, authentic or real by just sharing that autobiography. It's trying to give queer folks who play the game other possible outcomes. So another theme that crosses the queer games avant-garde is that these works often explore intimacy and kind of embrace that intimacy. So one example that I really love is a kind of mixed media work by a VR artist named Shauna Musgrave. So this is a piece that Shauna, in her interview, talks about showing in gallery spaces and spaces like Indiecade. It's a VR piece, but unlike most VR out there, how it works is that the person experiencing it lays down, wears a VR headset. They're in a public space like a gallery. And what they see in the headset are animals who approach them. The one that I really love is they see kittens approaching them. And the kittens come and kind of nuzzle their face. But what's happening in real life is that Shauna has mittens on and is petting the face of the person who's experiencing it. So I think this is a really great example of taking technologies that we might associate with kind of hardcore, really like masculine games, and instead making them sweet and intimate and vulnerable. So here's how Shauna talks about this piece, which is called Animal Massage. "I wanted to have a personal one-on-one connection with the person who was having the VR experience. A lot of my games are touchy-feely, and part of that is figuring out how to relate to people. When you're queer and trans, your methods of being in relationships are more improvised." So it's that personal connection between Shauna as the designer, the developer, and the person experiencing it, but also as a kind of experimentation. How can we use game tools to think differently about how we connect? Related to that, another theme that comes out is how queer games avant-garde work often draws from personal and even embodied experiences. So it's not trying to represent some universal thing about being queer, about being trans, very much coming from developers' own physical experiences. So one example of this is this work called Become a Great Artist in Just 10 Seconds, which I really love. And I'm gonna show you, let's see if this video will work. I'm gonna show you a quick video of it because it's very abstract, and that's the point. And I'll tell you more about that in a second, but it kind of helps to see it. So let's see if this will work for us.
Video game music. I'm not gonna do it, but it's okay. I'll give you this. Go ahead. Yeah, I think there is something up with my connection as far as the drop.
So what you're seeing here is that this is a kind of art making tool where you've got kind of game-like elements, but it's also like a digital toy almost that you can use to make this very abstract kind of pixelated art. And what you're hearing here is Liz Ryerson, who's another queer game maker, is streaming it and kind of talking through her process. What I found super interesting is that when I talked to Andy McClure about this work, it seems so unrelated to the body, right? There's no bodies in there, it's just abstract art. But for her, that was still really related to these queer issues. So she said, part of why I'm drawn to abstraction is that it's like an escape from my identity. As a trans person, there are always things about my physical external self that I don't like. Video games or abstract art are a place where you don't have to have a body. To me, there's something that feels really good about floating in those abstractions. So the next thing I want to point out is this idea that queer games avant-garde work understands design itself as queer. So this one might be especially useful for folks who are designers themselves. This idea that it's not just what goes into the game, what the game looks like, that can resonate with queerness. It's actually the process of design itself. So an example of this that comes out in these interviews is the work of Laura McGee, who is best known for her game Curtain, which she published under the name Dreamfeel. But she talks about what she calls her flat games. So games that are made out of kind of almost crafted bits, drawn bits. This is the Isle is Full of Noises, which is made out of art assets that she drew using markers. And her work has this very like scrappy kind of zine-like quality that she ties actually to queerness. So she says, the way the games look is based on serendipity and the chance of what happened before. She's talking about making art assets by drawing things and then trying to put them together. I love finding ways to bring unpredictability into the creative process. You might say that's a way of queering video game making. It's definitely a not very straight way of approaching things. So by not planning things out ahead of time, by letting things be unpredictable, she's saying that she brings that kind of queer thinking into her design process. So those were some of the, threads that cross the project. But I also want to highlight some differences and tensions, because I wouldn't want to suggest that everyone who is part of this network of game makers agrees. There are definitely different ways that people think of things, and those tensions, those frictions are actually really revealing. So one of the things that came up a lot in these interviews is this question of a queer games community. So from the outside, often people get represented as being all part of one big queer and trans game community, but actually people really push back against that. So some people said, yes, there is absolutely community. For example, one interview is with Sarah Schumann, who has helped run Different Games, which is one of these conferences that's been a kind of center for queer games work. But then other people like Liz Ryerson, and this is Liz's game Problematic, said, you know, I never really felt like I fit in a queer games community. You know, maybe someone's community is different. It's a different artistic community. Maybe somebody felt, you know, on the outside of these groups. So there was definitely a friction there. There's also a tension around what should be in queer games. So for example, this question of whether queer games should represent queer sex was a real point of difference. So should a queer game actually have representations of sex in it? There were some people that I spoke with who felt really strongly that yes, queer games should have queer sex in them. So someone like Robert Yang, who makes pretty sexually explicit games, usually about sexual contact between men. For Yang, he said, you know, this is political. It's not just about wanting to see sex in games. It is a political choice to say, no, you know what, we're not going to shy away from this. This is an important part of queer experience. But then there were people who said, no, that's really sensationalizing. Queer games should not just focus on sex. They should be about queer experiences beyond sex. So for example, people talked about really loving this game Dream Daddy, which is not actually kind of part of this queer games avant-garde. It's not primarily made by queer people, but it's a game that is a queer dating sim. It's about dads dating other dads, and has almost no sex in it. So some people said that was great because they felt like it took that sensational, you know, like voyeuristic element out. So those are two very different opinions. And this one really struck me. This is one that I'm kind of doing more and more thinking about going forward, is this tension between what we might think of as a brighter future versus an apocalypse. So this comes up a lot in the way that popular news stories talk about queer games. So I think often there's an idea that queer games are going to make the industry more diverse. They're going to make the medium better. And there are some queer games avant-garde artists who feel that way, who want to do that. But actually, a theme that comes up in a lot of this work is apocalypse, is the end of the world, and an idea that kind of far from trying to make the world better, really the only way forward is to destroy it. So on the one hand, we have work like games by Nikki Case. This is one of Nikki's earlier works, Coming Out Simulator. Nikki also makes a lot of kind of browser-based interactive educational, they're not exactly games, but experiences. And the goal of those really is to educate people, to say, you know, here's where bias comes from. Here's what it's like to come out. So that's the kind of making the world better side. But then on the other side, you have games like Gender Wrecked, which is really about a kind of post-apocalyptic world where gender has destroyed the world as we know it. It's populated by these kind of monstrous creatures who are also beautiful. And it raises questions about whether maybe the only way for us to find a world where queer and trans people can live might be to destroy the world as we know it. So given those threads, given those tensions, I just want to close by offering some new ways of thinking that the queer games avant-garde offers us. So this is kind of what we can take from this work that extends even further than this already really wide network of game makers. So the first thing is this idea that video games are changing. We hear that a lot. You know, we're seeing more and more kind of artistic indie games. We're seeing games kind of question their own politics, their own norms. And I think that is true. I think they are slowly changing, but they're changing because of queer people. So it's not just the industry deciding to make a difference. And it's not, you know, this vision of the kind of like lone white male genius indie designer. The people who are really pushing this change and exploring possibilities are queer people. We also see in this work the ways in which personal experience is political. So by that I mean, you know, these works often draw from really specific personal histories, from what it feels like to live in queer and trans bodies. But even though they're personal, they have this broader cultural meaning. I also love in this work the weirdness of so many of these games. So they often don't look like what we think of as games. Sometimes they don't even look like human bodies, right? They're often colorful and glitchy or sweet and soft and femme. But that too is a statement, because that's a statement about how we can make games in a way that doesn't have to look like the games we've gotten used to. And in a similar vein, these works kind of tie together what is weird, kind of quote unquote weird, and what is queer. So it looks for other strategies, this kind of area looks for other strategies of resistance that aren't just about, you know, literally putting LGBT characters in games or making the industry more diverse. It's also about looking for kind of more subversive things, like making the medium strange. So ultimately, to kind of come back to this question of boundaries and obstacles, it is definitely true that the work of the queer games avant-garde is pushing the medium in more diverse directions, more politically radical directions, and I mean that in a good way. But I think really importantly, it's also questioning us to think about what that means. So rather than just trying to make things better, it's pushing us to ask what it means to make things better. Who is it making things better for, right? And that goes back to this question of audience and empathy. Is it making things better for straight cis players who get to feel good about, you know, feeling like allies? Or is it actually making life better in a material way for the queer and trans people who make games and who play them? So I'm going to leave you with those questions, and let me exit out of this. So thank you so much for listening. I am really curious to hear your questions and your thoughts when we do our Q&A. And thanks so much. It's really been an honor to be here.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Bo. Bo will be available at the Discord of the play at 5 p.m. Central Europe time. And coming up next is on Channel 3, we will have Tolka and Jennifer at the workshop. And on 4:30, we'll have on Channel 1, Nina, Manu, and Mats. They will take a walk through the exhibition. So thank you very much for participating at the Impulse, and see you guys later. Bye.